For the next 20 years, I said, I'll have full federal law enforcement authority over every square inch of this protected habitat. I smiled at Veronica's stunned expression. Congratulations, your $890,000 mansion is now worth about $200,000, and thanks to permanent federal habitat protection, that value will never recover. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward Veronica, waiting for her response to the complete annihilation of everything she'd built. She stood frozen in her tailored suit, briefcase trembling in her grip, finally realizing that corporate intimidation tactics mean nothing when they collide with federal environmental law. "This is insane," she said, her voice cracking. "You're letting one bitter old man destroy an entire community over some stupid salamanders." Agent Santos stepped forward, handcuffs already in hand. "Veronica Ashworth, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal environmental law, corruption of public officials, wire fraud, and forgery of federal documents." As the cuffs snapped shut, Veronica delivered one final statement that perfectly captured her detachment from reality. "This is all his fault. I was just trying to improve property values." 8 months later, Pine Valley looks like a completely different world, and I mean that in the most beautiful way imaginable. The federal habitat designation brought changes none of us anticipated. Property taxes dropped from an average of $8,000 a year to under $900 due to conservation easement status. HOA fees were eliminated entirely. Federal law now prohibits non-essential maintenance activities within protected species habitat. Veronica's mansion sold at federal foreclosure auction for $168,000. The buyer, Dr. Sarah Martinez, an environmental science professor from Portland State University, is converting it into a field research station for graduate studies in wetland restoration and salamander conservation biology. The federal corruption trial ended with Mike Castellanos receiving 2 years probation and community service in exchange for full testimony against Veronica. She was far less fortunate. Wire fraud, document forgery, conspiracy, and attempted bribery earned her 42 months in federal prison, plus restitution to defrauded buyers. But the most profound transformation has been environmental. And Martha would have loved it. Without constant landscaping crews, native vegetation reclaimed areas that had been sterile lawns for 15 years. The salamander population has more than tripled, spreading throughout the watershed. We've documented nesting great blue herons, a family of river otters, and even a beaver colony that moved in last spring, constructing an elegant dam upstream from Veronica's concrete debris. Martha would have photographed those beavers for hours. My role as federal habitat monitor pays $68,000 annually, includes full health insurance and federal retirement benefits, and more importantly, grants me permanent authority to protect this ecosystem under federal law. I carry a federal badge now. I can issue citations for any environmental violations within the designated area. Last month, a Seattle development company tried to purchase 4 Pine Valley properties for what they called conservation-compatible luxury development. I explained that federal habitat protection recognizes no such exception. They canceled their contracts the same afternoon. Tom Bradley's foundation repairs were completed at federal expense under mandatory restoration requirements. His property value dropped, but the conservation easement eliminated his mortgage entirely. Banks cannot foreclose on protected conservation land, and his property taxes dropped 87%. "I'm actually making money," Tom told me recently, while helping monitor salamander egg masses. No mortgage, minimal taxes, federal grants covering everything. Sarah visits every weekend now, often bringing her 2 daughters to explore their grandmother's oak grove and learn amphibian life cycles. The trees didn't just recover, they grew stronger, nourished by restored wetland ecology. Sometimes I catch Sarah quietly talking to Martha beneath the big oak, updating her on conservation victories across the country. The local elementary school has adopted our site as their permanent outdoor classroom. Every Friday, 35 fourth graders arrive with magnifying glasses and notebooks, bursting with excitement over salamander larvae and native plant identification. Dr. Declan leads the program, transforming environmental crime into living conservation lessons. We established the Martha Hutchinson Environmental Education Fund, providing scholarships for students pursuing careers in environmental protection and restoration. Donations now arrive from conservation organizations nationwide. Next month, the EPA is sending a documentary crew to film Pine Valley as a national case study in accidental habitat restoration through environmental crime remediation. It will be used to train environmental enforcement officers across the country. Some mornings, I still wake up expecting to hear concrete mixers destroying something sacred. Instead, I hear creek water flowing over stone beds, woodpeckers echoing through the grove, and the splash of beavers repairing their dam upstream. The house no longer smells like lavender sachets and old grief. It smells like fresh coffee, clean creek air, and wild roses reclaiming what was once Veronica's prize-winning garden. Martha's Memorial Grove became something far greater than either of us imagined, a federally protected ecosystem that will educate generations about stewardship and justice. Some evenings, while updating habitat monitoring reports, I find myself speaking to Martha's old chair. "Counted 47 salamander egg masses today," I'll say. "The herons are nesting again." I know she's proud. Thanks for listening. If you've lived through HOA nightmares or fought for environmental justice, share your story below. I love hearing how ordinary people push back against corruption. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about underdogs who refuse to let petty tyrants win. Sometimes the good guys really do prevail, especially when federal environmental law gets involved. The air conditioning system couldn't handle the crowd. Windows were thrown open and heated voices spilled out across the neighborhood. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos sat in the front row with a briefcase full of federal evidence, bribery recordings, forged documents, and detailed environmental crime reports. David Park had his official habitat designation paperwork prepared for public presentation. Dr. Declan brought large photographic displays documenting the protected salamander population that would now dictate everyone's future. I sat in the back beside Sarah, watching Veronica's carefully constructed world collapse in front of every person who had trusted her leadership. Board Chairman Robert Hriss called the meeting to order with visible reluctance, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. We're here to address recent developments regarding federal environmental restrictions that may affect our community. Veronica stood immediately, wearing the same power suit she'd worn while attempting to bribe federal officials. Her voice still carried that polished pharmaceutical sales confidence, but desperation crackled underneath it like static. Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with a temporary regulatory misunderstanding that's being deliberately blown out of proportion by certain individuals with personal grudges against community leadership. She gestured vaguely in my direction without making eye contact. Federal environmental designations can be appealed through proper legal channels, especially when they're based on biased reporting from disgruntled neighbors who lack professional environmental expertise. Agent Santos rose slowly, her federal credentials catching the fluorescent light. "Ma'am, I'm Special Agent Maria Santos with the FBI Environmental Crimes Unit. There is no appeal process for habitat designation based on documented protected species breeding activity." The clubhouse went dead silent, except for the failing hum of the air conditioning. Veronica's face flushed bright red as she realized federal law enforcement was about to dismantle every promise she'd made. "Furthermore," Agent Santos continued, consulting her notes, "this investigation has expanded beyond environmental violations. We are currently investigating charges of official corruption, wire fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to obstruct federal environmental enforcement." Steve Morrison, a tech executive who'd paid cash for his million-dollar home, raised his hand with visible anxiety. Agent Santos, what does federal habitat designation mean for our property values? David Park answered with clinical precision. Federal habitat designation typically reduces affected property values by 60 to 70%. However, property taxes decrease proportionally, and residents qualify for federal conservation tax benefits. The room erupted. 200 voices shouted questions, accusations, threats of lawsuits. I caught fragments of panic. Veronica said this was temporary. My pool permits are useless now. How much are our homes actually worth? Can we sue the HOA? Janet Morrison, Tom Bradley's wife, stood on her chair. Everyone needs to understand something. Veronica knew about this federal investigation when she scheduled her mansion sale. She's been lying to all of us. That's completely untrue, Veronica shouted, her professional composure finally shattering. I was protecting this community from environmental extremists trying to destroy property rights. That's when I stood. The room slowly quieted as residents turned to look at me, Earl Hutchinson, the quiet widower they'd watched tend Martha's garden for 15 years, the man whose environmental complaint had triggered everything. Veronica, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the packed clubhouse, you destroyed my wife's memorial grove with an illegal creek diversion conducted without permits or environmental review. You forged county officials to conceal Clean Water Act violations. You forged federal environmental documents to deceive homebuyers. I paused, letting every word land. But here's what you never understood about federal environmental law. Sometimes criminal environmental destruction accidentally creates something more valuable than what was destroyed. David Park held up the official habitat assessment photographs. The illegal creek diversion inadvertently created the healthiest northwestern salamander breeding habitat documented in the Columbia River watershed in over 20 years. Your corruption, I looked directly at Veronica, triggered permanent federal protection. Your greed transformed a luxury neighborhood into a conservation success story that will be studied by environmental scientists for decades. The room was silent now, every resident absorbing the full irony. Veronica, I said, you once asked what I intended to do about your environmental crimes. I took a breath. I'm accepting the federal habitat monitor position. As Veronica staggered back toward her mansion, Mike Castellanos approached me wearing the hollow expression of a man who knew his career was over. Earl, he said quietly, I'm resigning from county service today. I'm filing a full corruption report with the district attorney this afternoon. By Wednesday morning, Veronica was in full panic mode. The federal habitat designation was now public record, posted across environmental databases that real estate agents monitor religiously. She had 48 hours before her mansion sale was set to close, $890,000 about to dissolve into conservation-restricted property worth a fraction of that. I learned about her final desperate scheme from my neighbor, Tom Bradley, whose wife sat on the HOA's Architectural Review Committee. Earl, Tom told me Wednesday evening, she called an emergency board meeting for 6 a.m. tomorrow. Linda says Veronica's claiming the federal situation is temporary and totally appealable. She's telling her buyers the designation will be overturned. That was technically possible, but practically unheard of. Northwestern salamander habitat designations based on established breeding populations are almost never reversed, especially when the habitat enhancement resulted from illegal environmental modification. Veronica was betting her buyers wouldn't understand federal environmental law. The sale was scheduled to close Friday afternoon, just ahead of the enforcement timeline that would make it legally impossible. Sarah and I spent Wednesday night buried in Oregon real estate disclosure statutes, building the case that would destroy her fraudulent sale attempt. Dad, if she closes without disclosing the federal environmental investigation and habitat restrictions, that's federal wire fraud on top of everything else, Sarah said, scrolling through legal databases. Interstate buyers, electronic fund transfers, federal jurisdiction applies automatically. Thursday morning at 5 a.m., I positioned myself in Tom Bradley's backyard with binoculars and a telephoto lens. If Veronica was planning another cover-up, I wanted it documented for federal prosecutors. The emergency HOA board meeting began precisely on schedule at the Pine Valley Clubhouse. Through my binoculars, I watched Veronica presenting documents to 5 board members, her real estate attorney, and what looked like an environmental consultant she'd hired overnight. At 6:30, my blood ran cold. She was displaying a stack of official-looking papers, clearly forged federal environmental clearances, claiming the salamanders were seasonal migrants with no permanent breeding habitat. She was fabricating federal documents to deceive buyers and bypass habitat protection law. I called Sarah immediately. She's creating fake environmental reports with forged federal letterhead. Document everything, Sarah said. I'm calling the buyer's attorney right now. At 7:15 a.m., I called the buyers myself, Robert and Jennifer Patterson, a retired couple from Sacramento planning to relocate to Oregon for environmental reasons. The irony was almost painful. Mr. Patterson, this is Earl Hutchinson, your future neighbor. Oh yes, he said warmly. Veronica mentioned you might call. She said you're very particular about landscaping. Has she disclosed the federal environmental investigation affecting your property? Silence. What federal investigation? I explained the habitat designation, the federal protection status, the permanent development restrictions. The silence stretched nearly 2 minutes. You're telling me our home is now a federally protected environmental preserve? The entire neighborhood, I said. No pools, no additions, no landscaping changes without federal permits that cost tens of thousands and take years. But we're closing tomorrow. We've already transferred the down payment. I strongly recommend speaking with an environmental attorney before signing anything else. Thursday afternoon delivered the reckoning I'd been waiting for. The Pattersons' attorney, David Kim of Sacramento, called Veronica demanding full disclosure. When she produced her forged clearances, Kim recognized them instantly as fraudulent. The EPA regional director whose signature appeared had died 3 years earlier. The letterhead contained spelling errors no federal agency would ever make. Ms. Ashworth, Kim told her in a recorded call Sarah later obtained, these documents appeared to be federal forgeries. I'm forwarding them to the FBI Document Analysis Unit. At 3 p.m., Sarah called laughing. Dad, the sale just collapsed. The Pattersons are suing her for fraud, misrepresentation, conspiracy, and intentional concealment. Criminal referrals are being filed for document forgery and wire fraud. But Veronica's nightmare was only beginning. Friday afternoon at 2 p.m., Pine Valley held the most explosive town hall meeting in its 15-year history. What began as an emergency HOA session to address environmental complications turned into a public trial of corruption, environmental crime, and the spectacular downfall of a petty tyrant. The clubhouse overflowed with more than 200 residents, with people spilling onto the pool deck and lawn. Local news crews arrived after receiving tips about a federal environmental crimes investigation, and Veronica Ashworth was about to face the consequences of everything she'd done. I mapped every salamander pool, every fragment of concrete debris, every altered water flow pattern created by Veronica's crimes. The scattered demolition chunks weren't random rubble. They'd settled into natural-looking check dams that formed ideal amphibian breeding conditions. Shallow pools linked by gentle riffles, rocky substrates perfect for egg attachment, stable water temperatures, and abundant insect food sources. Veronica's environmental vandalism had accidentally engineered the perfect northwestern salamander nursery. Working by flashlight in the pre-dawn darkness, I planted native wetland species around the pools. Nothing invasive, nothing that would disrupt natural ecosystem development, just strategic reinforcement of vegetation already establishing itself. Cattails, rush grass, Pacific Nine bark, monkey flower. The rich scent of pond mud clung to my boots as I worked, pulling memories of childhood creek explorations with my grandfather to the surface. Saturday morning marked the legal strategy phase. Sarah arrived with 2 briefcases packed with federal environmental documentation, habitat protection protocols, species assessment criteria, enforcement procedures, and binding case law precedents. We spread everything across Martha's dining room table, transforming it into a command center for environmental warfare. "Here's the timeline, Dad," Sarah said, consulting federal regulatory schedules. County Inspector Mike Castellanos arrives Tuesday at 9 a.m., accompanied by State Environmental Specialist David Park. If they confirm protected breeding habitat, which they absolutely will, federal designation becomes automatic and irreversible by noon. And then, I asked, emergency protection status takes effect immediately. No modifications anywhere in the designated area. Restoration orders begin within 30 days. Property use restrictions become permanent. But Sarah had uncovered something even more powerful than simple habitat designation. "Dad, the 2024 Waters Protection Act includes a special provision for habitat enhancement monitoring positions. If you accept the federal appointment, you'll have law enforcement authority over the entire protected zone." Law enforcement authority, the power to issue federal citations for habitat violations. After 30 years of environmental protection work, I'd have the legal authority to ensure no one could ever threaten Martha's Oak Grove again. Saturday afternoon brought the financial calculations that would devastate Pine Valley's wealthy residents. I spread property tax assessments and real estate valuations across the kitchen table, running numbers that filled me with grim satisfaction. Current Pine Valley property values totaled $43 million. Post-designation conservation values, approximately $15 million. Total destruction caused by Veronica's crimes, $28 million. More specifically, Veronica's $890,000 mansion would drop to perhaps $200,000 as conservation-restricted land. Her neighbors would lose similar percentages. Tech executives discovering their million-dollar investments had become environmental preservation sites overnight. But the devastation didn't stop at property values. The HOA's $12,000 annual fees would become federally illegal. Habitat preservation prohibits non-essential human activity. No landscaping crews, no pool maintenance, no irrigation systems, no exterior modifications of any kind. Monday morning, I met Dr. Rebecca Declan and her federal assessment team at the County Environmental Office. The lead scientist was genuinely excited, describing the site as an exceptional case of accidental habitat creation through environmental crime remediation. "Mr. Hutchinson," Dr. Declan said, consulting species protection databases, "this represents the most significant northwestern salamander population recovery we've recorded in the Columbia River watershed in over 20 years. We'll recommend federal designation as a model conservation success." The explanation was elegant in its simplicity. When a natural creek is illegally diverted, it sometimes creates superior habitat conditions compared to the original ecosystem. Translation: Veronica's crime had become an environmental miracle. Monday evening brought final coordination. Sarah arranged for environmental advocacy groups to conduct coincidental wildlife surveys during the inspection. 3 wildlife photographers, 2 graduate students from Portland State University, a freelance journalist specializing in conservation success stories. All legal, all perfectly timed. At 8 p.m., I called Tom Bradley. "By Wednesday morning, the HOA becomes legally responsible for your foundation repair under federal restoration requirements. They'll cover everything they damaged. Your property taxes will drop from $8,000 a year to under $1,000 due to conservation easement status." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Earl," he said finally, "you turned disaster into a blessing." Tuesday morning at 6 a.m., I walked through Martha's Oak Grove one last time before the inspection that would change everything. The trees stood strong, fully recovered from flood damage, soon to be protected forever. The salamander pools reflected sunrise colors, filled with life that embodied Martha's deepest values: conservation, healing, hope. In 3 hours, Veronica would learn that corruption has consequences. At 7:30 a.m., just as I finalized documentation, Veronica made her most desperate move yet. I was reviewing salamander population counts when her voice cut through the morning air like fingernails on a chalkboard. She stood in her backyard, phone pressed to her ear, maybe 40 yards from where federal biologists would soon work. "What do you mean you can't stop a federal inspection?" she shouted. "I paid you to handle county problems." She was pacing wildly, panic amplifying her voice across the neighborhood. "Cancel it immediately. Do you understand what this will do to property values?" Through my kitchen window, I watched her gesturing furiously. She'd clearly spent the night researching federal law and finally grasped the catastrophe she'd triggered. 10,000 cash, she said into the phone. "Just make it go away." At 8:25, Veronica marched across her lawn toward the county vehicle parked near Creek Access. She wore her corporate intimidation outfit: dark power suit, severe heels, and expensive briefcase. She approached Inspector Castellanos and State Environmental Specialist David Park with the confidence of a pharmaceutical sales rep entering a hostile boardroom. "I'm Veronica Ashworth, HOA president," she announced, extending a manicured hand neither man accepted. Castellanos stepped back, sweat already visible on his uniform. "Miss Ashworth, this is a routine inspection." "There's nothing routine about this," she snapped. "Our work was emergency flood prevention." David Park glanced up from his meter. "Ma'am, I'm documenting protected species habitat. Construction legality isn't my jurisdiction." Her confidence flickered. Protected species? Impossible. "I'm looking at the healthiest northwestern salamander breeding population I've seen in 5 years, Park said. Her face cycled through confusion, realization, and rage. Months of planning her mansion sale evaporated as she grasped what federal designation meant. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "Some grieving old man complains, and suddenly we have endangered species?" That's when Veronica sealed her fate. She pulled out her phone and made a call directly in front of federal recording equipment. "Jim, it's Veronica. I need you to cancel this federal inspection right now." She paused, listening, then spoke words that would soon appear in federal court transcripts. 10,000 cash, same arrangement as before. Make these federal people disappear." David Park froze. Dr. Declan raised her phone and began recording. "Miss Ashworth, are you attempting to influence a federal environmental assessment with money?" Veronica realized her mistake 3 seconds too late. We're just trying to protect property values." "Ma'am," Dr. Declan interrupted, "you just attempted to bribe federal environmental scientists. This conversation is being forwarded to the FBI Environmental Crimes Unit." The words FBI and environmental crimes drained the color from Veronica's face. "I think I need my attorney," she whispered. "That's wise," David replied calmly. "You'll also want to contact Special Agent Maria Santos. She handles environmental crimes prosecutions." Mike called to arrange what he very deliberately described as a comprehensive environmental assessment of both my property and the HOA's concrete work. He also mentioned he'd be bringing a state environmental specialist as a consulting observer. But news moves quickly in small communities, especially when money and corruption are involved. By the weekend, Veronica had clearly realized her bribery scheme was unraveling, and she shifted into damage control mode. Sunday evening, my neighbor Janet Priskel called with a warning that sent a chill straight through me. "Earl, I'm getting strange phone calls about you," she said. "Women asking if you seem confused lately, if your family's worried about your mental state, whether you should still be living alone." Janet had lived next door for 15 years. She'd watched Martha battle cancer, helped me through those final months of hospice care, brought casseroles when I couldn't bring myself to cook. She knew exactly what these calls meant. "What kind of women?" I asked. "Older voices," she replied. "They say they're concerned neighbors from Pine Valley, but when I ask for names so I can call them back, they hang up." Monday morning brought the coordinated attack I'd expected. 3 anonymous calls flooded the county environmental office, all reporting my supposed erratic behavior and harassment of officials. The complaints claimed I was suffering from grief-related mental decline and shouldn't be trusted to live independently. I recognized the tactic immediately from my federal enforcement years. When corrupt organizations couldn't fight the law directly, they attacked the credibility of the whistleblower. Character assassination, manufactured mental health concerns, anything to undermine legitimate reporting. But Veronica made a critical mistake. She underestimated both my experience and my family. Tuesday afternoon, my daughter Sarah drove down from Portland carrying a briefcase full of documentation that would obliterate Veronica's harassment campaign. Sarah is 42, an environmental attorney with her mother's razor-sharp analytical mind and absolutely zero tolerance for bullies who prey on vulnerable people. "Dad, tell me everything," she said, settling into Martha's old chair on the back porch, where we'd shared 1,000 conversations. I walked her through the illegal creek diversion, the bribery, and the coordinated effort to paint me as mentally incompetent. Sarah took notes the same meticulous way Martha used to, every detail logged, every timeline verified, every piece of evidence cataloged. "This woman has no idea who she's dealing with," Sarah said, when I finished. "Environmental law is my specialty, and corruption cases are my favorite." Wednesday morning, Sarah spent 2 hours at the county office presenting my medical records to Environmental Division Supervisor Martinez. Clean bill of health, annual physical, cognitive scores in the 95th percentile, no signs of decline or confusion. "My father is one of the most qualified environmental specialists in the state," she told Martinez. "These anonymous complaints are retaliatory harassment designed to silence legitimate whistleblowing about official corruption." But Sarah's visit accomplished something far more important than clearing my name. As an environmental law specialist, she immediately recognized the federal implications of Veronica's actions, implications that would transform this from a local drainage dispute into a federal environmental crisis. That evening, Sarah spread federal regulations across Martha's old dining room table, the same table where Martha once planned her garden layouts during chemo treatments. What my daughter uncovered would turn Veronica's illegal creek diversion into an environmental nightmare. "Dad, this isn't just a county issue anymore," Sarah said, pointing to sections of the 2024 Federal Waters Protection Act. Under the new regulations, any county drainage inspection that affects protected watersheds automatically triggers EPA wetland assessment protocols. I'd been so focused on corruption that I'd missed the larger picture. These regulations were designed to stop exactly what Veronica had done: unsupervised habitat modification by developers who believed local bribes could override federal law. "Here's the beautiful part," Sarah continued, pulling up satellite images. "Willow Creek feeds directly into the Columbia River watershed. Any modification requires federal review, but Veronica's concrete dam accidentally created something that qualifies for federal wetland protection." She showed me before and after aerial photos. The backed-up water had formed 3 distinct pools on the HOA side of the dam. Sediment collected, native plants emerged, waterfowl returned, species seen in decades. Environmental assessments focus on protected species habitat, and guess what thrives in seasonal pools like these? I already knew. Northwestern salamanders. "Exactly," Sarah said, "protected under the Endangered Species Act. If breeding habitat is confirmed, the entire area becomes federally protected wetland with no appeals." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, from anticipation. I kept hearing Martha's voice. "Promise me you'll fight for what matters, Earl." Veronica thought she was silencing a grieving old man. Instead, she'd triggered a federal investigation capable of destroying everything she'd built. But we had to be careful. Sarah warned me that Veronica's pharmaceutical background meant she understood regulatory manipulation better than most. She said, "We need to be smarter than she is, and ready for whatever she does when she realizes what's coming." Thursday morning brought an unexpected gift. While checking my trail camera, installed to monitor flooding, I noticed unusual movement in the new pools behind the dam. Small, dark shapes moving in patterns I recognized instantly. I grabbed my binoculars. Northwestern salamander larvae. Dozens, maybe hundreds, thriving in the habitat Veronica had created. That night, Veronica made her most desperate move yet. Around 2 a.m., I woke to hydraulic equipment and diesel fumes drifting through my window. Someone was operating heavy machinery near the dam, trying to erase evidence under cover of darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and camera and hurried outside in my bathrobe. Work lights reflected off the creek. 3 workers jackhammered the concrete, chunks tumbling into the water, turning it muddy brown. Veronica was trying to destroy evidence of federal crimes. "Stop," I shouted. "You're destroying evidence of Clean Water Act violations." The foreman, the same man from before, strode to the property line. "Private property," he said. "Emergency repairs." "At 2 in the morning without permits?" "Emergency work doesn't require permits," he shrugged. "Flood risk." It was a lie. The clubhouse sat uphill on engineered drainage systems that had worked for years. I understood her plan. Remove the dam, claim the pools were natural. She assumed I lacked the energy to fight back. She was catastrophically wrong. Her midnight demolition created an even bigger problem. Scattered concrete formed chaotic mini-dams, backing up water in impossible-to-explain patterns. Instead of erasing evidence, she made it permanent. Thursday morning, Sarah called. "Dad, I've been reading the Federal Waters Protection Act all night. This law isn't just about assessment, it's about automatic designation. Any inspection identifying protected habitat now triggers immediate federal protection, no appeals, no delays. And here's the best part," Sarah continued. "Once emergency protection kicks in, all previous modifications must be restored at the violator's expense." I understood instantly. The inspection Veronica tried to block would now lock the entire Pine Valley neighborhood under habitat preservation. "What does that mean for property values?" I asked. Sarah laughed softly. 60 to 70% reduction. No modifications without federal permits. I sat on the porch watching sunlight dance across the salamander pools, listening to water flow over concrete debris. For the first time since Martha's funeral, I felt peace. "One more thing," Sarah said. "As the first to document the habitat, you qualify as the Federal Habitat Monitor, paid position, $65,000 a year, full authority to protect Martha's oak grove forever." We still had to be strategic. Veronica could panic again. The inspection was scheduled for Tuesday, 5 days to ensure everything went perfectly. That afternoon, I walked through Martha's oak grove, touching each tree she'd planted. New growth shimmered in the light. The salamander pools glistened with protected life. Tomorrow, Veronica would learn her corruption had triggered the very federal force she tried to buy off. That night, I didn't sleep, from anticipation. 30 years of enforcement experience was about to snap shut like a trap. I jolted awake at 3 a.m. to the thunder of concrete trucks tearing through my backyard. By the time I stepped outside in my bathrobe, the little creek my late wife loved more than anything, where she would sit for hours just listening to the water, had been buried beneath an illegal concrete dam. Standing there was the HOA president, Veronica Ashworth, smirking as she said, "Mosquito control, deal with it." What she didn't know was that I'd spent 30 years as an EPA water quality specialist. I know federal wetland regulations inside and out. One county complaint, one federal inspection, and suddenly her entire $1 million neighborhood was redesignated as protected federal wetland, untouchable forever. What would you do if someone destroyed the last place that still gave you peace after losing your wife? Tell me in the comments and let me know where you're watching from tonight. This story gets brutal. Trust me, you'll be cheering by the end. My name is Earl Hutchinson. I'm 58 years old and I live in the cottage where my wife Martha and I spent our final years together. The sound of Willow Creek flowing past our bedroom window used to lull her to sleep during the worst of her chemo treatments. On the nights when the pain medication failed, she'd ask me to open the windows wider so she could hear the water more clearly. Martha planted that oak grove along the creek's edge during her second remission, when her oncologist suggested gardening therapy to help with depression. Every tree was a small victory over cancer. She'd sit in her wheelchair, directing me where to dig, her voice growing stronger with each sapling. "Promise me something, Earl," she said during her final hospital stay, tubes winding around her fragile arms. "If anything ever threatens this place, you fight for it. Don't let them destroy beautiful things just because they can." The steam from my morning coffee still blends with the creek mist the same way it did when Martha sat on our back porch, wrapped in her favorite quilt, the blue one her grandmother made. The floorboards still creak where her wheelchair once rolled, especially on quiet mornings when fog hangs low over the water. I've been retired from the EPA for 3 years now, spending my days caring for my father as his dementia worsens, while my daughter Sarah visits on weekends from her environmental law practice in Portland. The house smells of Old Spice aftershave and the lavender sachets Martha tucked into every drawer. I can't bring myself to remove them. Pine Valley HOA sits upstream from my property, one of those gated developments filled with cookie-cutter mansions where tech executives and real estate moguls pay $12,000 a year for the privilege of living behind walls. The place boasts its own golf course, 3 tennis courts, and a clubhouse that looks more like a boutique hotel. Veronica Ashworth rules it like her personal empire. She's 52, a former pharmaceutical sales rep who made her fortune pushing blood pressure meds to cardiologists before jumping into luxury real estate. Everything about Veronica screams money. The cloying perfume you smell from 20 feet away, the BMW with vanity plates reading Luxury One, a voice sharp enough to cut glass when she gives orders. Right now, she's trying to sell her own $890,000 mansion, Italian marble countertops, an infinity pool, and a wine cellar worth more than most people's cars. She needed the neighborhood looking flawless for wealthy buyers from California. The trouble began when heavy spring rains caused what Veronica called unsightly pooling near the clubhouse. Standing water, she claimed, would attract mosquitoes and make the place look swampy and unprofessional. Her solution? Divert Willow Creek entirely using concrete barriers, sending all the water through my backyard. No permits, no environmental impact study, no notice to downstream property owners like me, just a midnight construction crew and enough concrete to build a small bridge. I woke that Tuesday to the diesel growl of machinery and the sharp chemical smell of wet concrete drifting through my bedroom window. By the time I staggered outside in my bathrobe, they'd already installed a 3-foot concrete dam straight across the creek, about 50 yards upstream from Martha's oak grove. The foreman, a big man in a hard hat with concrete dust on his boots, barely looked up from his clipboard. "HOA work order," he grunted, pointing to official-looking papers. "Emergency mosquito abatement, done by noon." Within hours, the damage was severe. My basement began flooding as the redirected creek overwhelmed drainage patterns that had worked perfectly for 32 years. A musty, moldy stench crept up through the floorboards as brown water seeped through foundation cracks I'd never seen before. Worse, the diversion was drowning Martha's oak grove, the trees she planted during remission, each one a symbol of hope and healing. I called Veronica immediately, my hands shaking with fury. Her response was cold. "Natural water management isn't our responsibility, Earl. Your property has always been prone to flooding during heavy rains." It was a lie, and she knew it. In 32 years, my basement had never taken on a single drop of water. But Veronica made one fatal mistake. The next morning, I did what any rational person would do. I filed a formal complaint with the county environmental office. Using my EPA training, I documented everything: the unpermitted creek diversion, GPS coordinates of the illegal dam, photographs of my flooded basement, and water quality measurements showing contamination in my well. I included a detailed technical analysis explaining how the project violated the Clean Water Act, state regulations, and county drainage ordinances. 30 years of federal enforcement experience made the complaint airtight, or so I thought. 3 days later, Inspector Mike Castellanos called. He sounded exhausted, like a man buried under petty neighbor disputes. Mr. Hutchinson, I've reviewed your complaint about the HOA drainage project. I'll be out Friday morning to take a look and get this sorted out. Mike had a reputation for being thorough, someone who read the reports and followed up properly. I felt confident justice would win. Friday came and went. No inspector. At 5 p.m., I called the county office. The secretary put me on hold for 15 minutes before returning with news that made my blood boil. Inspector Castellanos completed his site visit yesterday afternoon. No violations, case closed. Impossible. The dam was still there, visible from space if you knew where to look. I'd provided coordinates, photographs, flow data. Ma'am, I said carefully, the inspector never visited my property. According to his report, he conducted a thorough investigation from multiple vantage points. No evidence of environmental damage. From where? The International Space Station? I drove to the HOA clubhouse, past manicured lawns that likely cost more to maintain than most people earn in a year. I found Veronica in the rose garden, wearing pristine gardening gloves and watering roses with a silver can. "Heard you had trouble with your complaint," she said without looking up, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "The inspector never came to my property," I replied. She turned and smiled, the kind that works in boardrooms but never reaches the eyes. Maybe he saw everything he needed from the clubhouse parking lot. County officials are very efficient. Every alarm bell from my 30 years of investigations went off. I'd heard that confidence before, from executives who believed money erased federal law. We called it regulatory arrogance syndrome. That afternoon, I called Castellanos directly. "Mike, the flooding is getting worse. I'd appreciate a proper inspection." He repeated his line about working it out. "Accommodations for what?" I asked. "Environmental crimes?" Silence. "You're a reasonable guy," he said finally. "These HOA people have resources." Bingo. "Mike," I said, steel in my voice, "I spent 30 years investigating federal environmental crimes. I know corruption when I hear it. You want to reconsider?" 30 seconds passed. "I'm implying," I continued, "that I have photos of you accepting PASH from Veronica Ashworth, and you have 24 hours to schedule a real inspection before I send everything to the Ethics Board and the FBI. His breathing was audible. "You recorded us?" he asked. "Of course I did," I said. "Question is, do you want to fix this quietly or explain your income to federal agents?" Friday morning brought exactly the response I'd hoped for.